Hello there, and welcome to today's recap of the manhwa series titled Ranker Who Lives a Second Time. In a nutshell, it's a story based on an older brother who becomes infuriated as well as hellbent on seeking revenge after learning how his beloved younger brother was betrayed and stabbed to death in some strange kinda isekai world with a mysterious tower standing at its center. Curious what happens next? Such as how the clever protagonist named Yeon-woo plots his revenge scheme, climbs the godly tower step by step, annihilates all his enemies, and finally ends up becoming an omnipotent being? Well, we're no doubt gonna elaborate this story in detail, but before that happens, do eradicate the like and subscribe buttons. Now then, 5 years ago, Yeon-woo's brother Jung-woo disappeared forever in a rather mysterious fashion. Fast forward to today and our protagonist finally receives news of his long-lost brother. Sadly enough, Jung-woo's already dead by now, and all that's left of him is merely a photograph as well as a broken pocket watch. From the looks of it, Jung-woo must have been partaking in the shooting of a film or something. After all, there's no other reason for him to be wearing such bizarre clothing as a knight's armor otherwise. Just then though, Yeon-woo starts hearing his brother's voice from inside the watch all of a sudden. Yeon-woo soon confirms that he isn't having an auditory hallucination and that his brother truly did leave some sort of memoir to help dictate all his experiences from the past 5 years. Guess what? About 5 years ago, Jung-woo had bumped across a mysterious message, one questioning whether he would like to participate in the sun god's trial by climbing Obelisk, a gigantic tower that literally seems to pierce the sky. Upon successful completion of the many trials, Jung-woo will then be able to realize any of his wishes and heart's desires to come true. As it happens, their mother had been seriously ill back then and was bound to not last long unless a miracle happened. Jung-woo thus agreed to climb the tower without any hesitation, all so he could locate the all-healing elixir to help cure his mother. With that goal in mind, the courageous abandoned the comfort of his home and family and teleported to another unknown world in search of the elixir. Matters progressed smoothly at the beginning, and Jung-woo was certain of acquiring the elixir in no time at all. In fact, the talented and charismatic dude even formed his own team and named it as Ardia. Unfortunately, what follows next though is the heart-rendering tale of Jung-woo being backstabbed by not only his trusted allies, but also the woman he loved dearly. In the end, Jung-woo's beloved younger brother's heart was pierced by not just one or two, but 5 swords altogether, with 2 being from his best buddies as well as the love of his life, of course. Before dying though, Jung-woo left this detailed journal for his brother, hoping that Jung-woo will accomplish the mission he himself failed at and successfully procure the healing elixir for their mother. What Jung-woo is unaware of, though, is how their dearest mother passed away some 3 years ago. Hence, the only thing left for Yeon-woo to look forward to now is revenge. And this burning desire of revenge in his heart surely won't be quenched unless he beats the traitors who backstabbed his brother at their own game and ascertains their deaths in the most brutal way possible. That said, Yeon-woo officially enters the tower as his younger brother's successor and by doing so, inherits much of his brother's legacy. First of all, the dude studies his nature, which is cold-blooded. This basically means that no matter what the circumstances, Yeon-woo will always maintain his sense of calm and rationale. Not only that, but he's also become immune thanks to his cold-blooded nature. Up next is him attaining Dragon Eyes, a skill that bestows his eyes with X-ray abilities of sorts, granting him power to peek into the abilities of not just physical objects but also living people. Furthermore, Yeon-woo also inherits dragon blood, meaning that his body will one day morph into that of an actual dragon. Regrettably, it will take quite a while for him to fully attain the draconic body that is only 5% complete at present. Up next on our list are elevated senses, meaning that all 5 of Yeon-woo's physical senses have now become much sharper than the average player. Last but not least, the dude also unlocks the ability of foresight, which allows him to peek into the future, even if it's just for a second or two. On a side note, all that dragon stuff was inherited by Yeon-woo thanks to his brother's efforts from before. Yep, Jung-woo used to be quite talented back when alive, and even had a contract ongoing with Kalatuts, the ancient dragon, and therefore possessed many abilities similar to the noble dragon race. With that, Yunwoo finally begins his journey as an Avenger by first participating in the tutorial round on Floor 0. The manager, who's a green-colored goblin, patiently explains how the tutorial stage is divided into 7 different blocks, ranging from A to G. The players will be awarded with karma points equivalent to their achievements. Furthermore, in case one does have the guts, he can even try doing it solo, as it allows you to hoard way more points than the average player. The premise here is for those solo players to first arrive and come out in one piece, of course. Anyways, it's not as if our vengeful protagonist is scared of being all alone or something, especially once he recalls how his dearest little brother was stabbed in the back by his own comrades. Therefore, attempting the tutorial in solo mode is exactly what he's going to do. That said, Yunwoo soon enters Block A, which is basically a dark room filled with booby traps. At first, the dude has a hard time getting accustomed to the dark and is even miserably shot by half a dozen arrows in the process. Thankfully, his cold-blooded nature helps Yunwoo retain his composure and avoid panicking, etc. Up next, the dude utilizes his heightened senses skill to carefully listen for the sound of the arrow mechanism. This of course helps him to pinpoint the arrow's location even when covered by absolute darkness and ultimately avoid being hit by a single one from there forward. While dodging the arrows, Yunwoo is happily surprised to see all his strengths, such as stats like strength, speed, and endurance, level up quickly as well. Anyways, Block A ends without suspense soon enough. Just then, a mystery merchant approaches Yunwoo, offering to exchange various resources in return for his stat points as payment. What's weird is how, instead of buying himself a mighty artifact or something, Yunwoo ends up wasting all his points on a flimsy reset ticket. As the name suggests, this ticket holds the capability to reset its user's progress to the starting point of whatever level they just completed. In the eyes of others, this may indeed be the stupidest mistake ever. After all, one should be thinking of how to move forwards instead of redoing already covered territory, especially when it is a time-limited scenario. However, soon we learn that Yunwoo's true agenda is to redo Block A in a better way so he can acquire way more points than the average player, and also raise his stats even further than before. Afterwards, the dude finally heads inside Block A's boss room and comes face to face with a tough metallic puppet there. Thankfully, Yunwoo is able to point out the puppet's weakness thanks to his all-seeing dragon eyes. The dude of course leverages this knowledge to strike and destroy the opponent in just a couple of blows from his knife. Meanwhile, another player named Yule pops out of the shadows just then. Previously, Yule had attempted to give our protagonist a couple of hints on how to defeat the puppet. The two hit it off with a good start and even strike up a deal. Simply put, Yunwoo promises to help cover for Yule by letting him tag along and ultimately escape Block A alive, and with his whole body intact. In return, Yule is to help Yunwoo further his understanding of mana, such as how to see and control it, etc. Both dudes keep their end of the deal, thus creating a win-win situation. Just like that, Block A finally comes to an end, and the two soon step foot inside Block B's waiting area. Once outside, Yule ends up bumping into his past comrades. Turns out the reason why he was trapped at Block A all alone was thanks to these nasty fellows having betrayed and left him for dead earlier. Back in the present, Yunwoo's temper flares up a bit after realizing how Yule was backstabbed by his trusted allies in the same way as his brother. As a result, Yunwoo decides to hell with staying low-key and simply slashes away the enemy's team leader's arm all of a sudden. Then, without waiting for a split second, the cruel dude simply proceeds to beat everybody else up to a pulp. Meanwhile, Yule feels touched at the thought of Yunwoo claiming vengeance for his sake. However, since Yunwoo prefers to be alone, he soon bids farewell to Yule and the two part ways soon afterwards. Just then, it's revealed how two mysterious strangers had been very closely observing Yunwoo's fight just now. Not only that, but the red-headed dude named Khan estimates how Yunwoo must have definitely soloed Block A after analyzing the clues. That said, both Khan as well as his partner Doyle are won over by Yunwoo's talent and decide to continue keeping an eye on him for a while. Meanwhile, Yunwoo himself finally reaches the starting point for Block B. Turns out there's an option to choose going through one door from a set of 4, ranging from easiest to the most difficult one. After consulting his brother's journal, though, Yun-woo learns that there's a special reward waiting for the one who bashes through the toughest pathway represented by the black door. Seeing as how our protagonist is no chicken indeed, he walks right in. Soon, upon entering though, the dude is sneak attacked by a gigantic red centipede. The guy is thus sent flying and smashes hard against the cave's wall. Thankfully, his cold nature keeps Yun-woo composed and helps him avoid losing his consciousness. The dude soon becomes fed up of being beaten like a rag doll and uses his sharp observation skills to pinpoint the centipede's weakness. Turns out there's no armor protecting the centipede's abdomen. That said, a single fierce strike is all it takes for Yun-woo to win the match fair and square. In the battle's aftermath, the dude quickly digests the centipede's beast hard together with some magical herbs, since doing so will help greatly strengthen his muscles and bones. Once the upgrade is over, the dude simply goes on a killing spree by eliminating 1,000 other monsters and is thus able to level up heavily as a result. Finally, Yun-woo reaches the den of giant ants, beyond which lies Bathory's vampiric dagger that he craves so dearly. Left with no other choice, the ruthless dude simply utilizes his self-made explosive powder to blast away a ton of enemy ants into smithereens. Later, he lunges at the vampiric dagger while the enemy ranks are still in chaos. Here, we learn how Bathory's vampiric dagger is not really a weapon, but rather a technique, one whose true form can only be accessed after stabbing yourself with the knife. Thankfully, Yun-woo's pathway has already been paved clear of many obstacles by his dearest younger brother Jung-woo. As a result, claiming ownership of this unique skill proves as a no-brainer. Heck, Yun-woo even utilizes it to suck dry all of the enemy Ant Queen's vitality for himself. Doing so helps greatly elevate his stats as well as rank. Regrettably, he's still a far cry from the tutorial stage's top 3 players, who must all be busy roaming Block E by now. Anyways, Yun-woo refrains from enlisting his name on the ranking list, as doing so will earn him nothing except for the bothersome attention from his peers. On the flip side, both Khan and Doyle are seen following closely behind. The two are soon baffled after taking a peek at the Ant Queen's corpse and learning how the rookie Yun-woo has somehow unearthed such a unique skill for himself. This further impresses them both, while also strengthening their resolve to win Yun-woo over as an ally. Finally, the three come face to face with each other. Yun-woo is of course suspicious of the unknown intruders at first and suspects them to possess ulterior motives. However, both Khan and Doyle soon introduce themselves while also revealing that they both are the 3rd and 11th ranked players on the tutorial list respectively. The two soon cut to the chase. Turns out there's a reason why they came back from Block E all the way to Block B. Turns out there's a hidden lair within Block E that can't be conquered even with the combined efforts of both Khan and Doyle. Hence, the two have been busy scouting for a reliable partner with lots of potential back here in Block B. Anyways, Yoon agrees to form a temporary alliance with them both, as long as he's allowed to keep everything else other than the ultimate reward for himself once they finally end up conquering the hidden lair. Guess what? Yoon was able to guess beforehand exactly what prize both Khan and Doyle are after, thanks to his brother's diary. It's in fact the crown of the Lizard King Hargan. Such an artifact can help greatly boost one's commanding presence and authority. Needless to say, the crown is pretty much useless for our protagonist, who's more of a low-key kind of person and hates entering the spotlight. Long story short, the partnership is basically a win-win and shall prove beneficial for both parties. In the following days, Yoon rushes past both Block C and D in solo mode by having neither Khan nor Doyle interfere in his battles. Finally, the three end up reaching Block E and start venturing towards Hargan's hidden lair. Once there, Khan points out how Hargan's not the only enemy they have to deal with. Rather, his wife, the Lizard Queen Taragan, is also a formidable opponent. That said, it might be too perilous to face the enemy head-on, even with the three collaborating together. Hence, the best strategy would be for Khan to engage Hargan in a fight to keep him distracted. In the meantime, both Yoon and Doyle will invade the cave and steal the crown off the Lizard Queen's head. Everything goes as planned, with Khan facing off against her Lizard King while the others sneak inside the cave. Once there though, Doyle becomes flabbergasted upon spotting so many imprisoned human beings kept as food behind bars. Yoon, however, isn't of the mind to waste his time on bothersome weaklings, especially since doing so might endanger Khan's life since he's busy facing off against Hargan all alone as they speak. Just when Doyle is about to give up, Yoon's devious mind cooks up a plan to rescue not just the innocent prisoners, but also end up slaying the Lizard Queen. Up next, the two ambush the Queen and instantly set her on fire, while utilizing her helpless little babies as bait. This infuriates the Lizard King, who then rushes over to his wife's corpse and sucks away all of her vitality. As a result, the dude becomes multiple times stronger than before, to the point where not just Yoon but also Khan and Doyle's lives are in danger. Thankfully, their teamwork combined with Yoon's brilliant battle tactics pays off, and so the three soon end up slaying the beast. Yoon even drains the boss lizard of all his energy, and thus becomes much stronger himself as a result. Furthermore, the dude even gains the ability to infuse weapons with fire after having stolen it from Hargan, using his vampiric dagger skill. In the aftermath, Doyle frees the human prisoners from captivity. However, instead of being grateful, the leader of those shameless idiots starts blaming Yoon for being heartless since he didn't agree to save them instantly before when Doyle had first pleaded to do so. Khan, of course, isn't willing to let any random stranger badmouth and insult his fellow comrade, especially since Yoon himself got heavily injured in the process of slaying the cave's boss and rescuing all those ungrateful idiots. Anyways, the rescued men are soon intimidated by Khan's identity, and therefore are forced to apologize to Yoon despite not being the least bit willing to do so. With the conflict settled, the three decide to divide all the treasure as per their agreement. Doyle and Khan, of course, retain Hargan's crown for themselves. Meanwhile, all other rewards, including ownership of the cave, plus a ton of magic stones, as well as Hargan's sword, fall into Yoon's hands. Just then, the mysterious traitor appears yet again. Realizing why he's here, Yoon simply cuts to the chase by offering to sell all his rewards to the mystery traitor for a sky-high price. What happens next leaves everybody present dumbfounded, Yoon included. Simply put, despite feeling as if his heart's gonna start bleeding, the traitor nevertheless agrees to buy all that stuff off Yoonwoo's hands. This no doubt surprises Yoon by a great deal. The dude finally surmises how there must be a war on the brink of eruption at the tower grounds. After all, only that would explain the increase in demand for magic stones, which basically led to Yoon making off such a huge profit this time around. Anyways, he's still stuck within the tutorial stage. It's surely not Yoon's place to worry about the matters outside. Up next, both Doyle and Khan instantly agree to keep themselves accountable for the human survivors for a while. Regrettably, the shameless folk don't appreciate the trio's kindness the least bit. Instead, those nasty men start plotting to bite the hand that feeds them and steal all their belongings. Thankfully, Yoon is able to guess the enemy's entire plan beforehand by utilizing his heightened senses to keep an eye on them for a while. Furthermore, he even puts his dragon eyes to good use and learns that there's a massive group of scavengers lying in ambush up ahead. Yep, as it happens, among the people Yoon and the other two save is also the leader for a local scavenger group. These people are basically the scum of the tutorial stage since they first tool their fellow players and later end up betraying them and snatching away all of their belongings. Not only that, but the unlucky victims even end up being sold as slaves afterwards. Unfortunately, all those scavengers end up messing with the devil this time around. Seeing as how the enemy might launch their sneak attack any moment now, Yoon decides his best bet is to take the initiative himself and put the enemy off balance. As a result, the dude quietly creeps up to the enemy leader and slits his throat with a single swing of his knife. Doyle and Khan soon realize how they were tricked to death almost, and so a fearsome battle erupts shortly afterwards. Thankfully, Yoon's dragon eyes plus heightened senses allow him to locate and exterminate all the hidden enemies before they've got enough time to cook up a new strategy. Once it's all over though, Khan questions whether the reason behind why Yoon was able to guess the enemy's ulterior motives beforehand was because he never put his trust in anybody since the very beginning. If that's the case then, in the eyes of Yoon, both him and Doyle must also be considered as temporary acquaintances rather than permanent and trusted allies. That's fairly close to the truth, of course. He explains after all, unless he wishes to repeat the tragedy his brother faced, Yoon must rather prefer to stay suspicious and become isolated than to entrust his back to others in the tower. That said, the dude simply walks away without providing any explanations whatsoever. Doyle is of the mind to stop him, but Khan forbids him to do so. Turns out, he deliberately threw such hateful commands towards Yoon in order to push him away. The reason being that he had recognized the Arang group's signal on one of the weapons kept by the dead scavengers. This hints how these rotten men weren't just a bunch of random thieves. Instead, they must be puppets of the Arang group. What's funny is how Arang, which is the tutorial's most influential group, loves to act like an organization of saints. Heck, they even previously promised to organize regular patrols around the area for the sake of preventing any injustice from occurring and keeping matters fair. In reality, though, the Arang group is clearly in cahoots with the scavengers, who are then involved in all sorts of heinous activities such as human trafficking, robbery, etc. Long story short, Khan and Doyle, both of whom possess a strong moral compass, surely can't sit back after realizing how the tutorial stage is being held in check by such a nasty group. However, since the enemy is indeed the most influential group around and therefore quite dangerous, Khan doesn't wish to drag Yoon into such murky waters as well. Anyways, the two simply head straight for Arang's headquarters from there. On the flip side, Arang Group's manager named Build is quite aggravated after hearing news of so many of his men dying under Khan, Doyle, and Yoon's blade. He's just about to round up his elite men for a blanket surge when both Khan and Doyle proactively barge into the lion's den and together mount an assault against Build and his henchmen. Meanwhile, Yoon heads north in search of a rare snake species known as the Akasha's snake. This beast only pops out of the earth to breathe fresh air on a rare occasion and is therefore very tricky to locate. Luckily, his brother Jung-woo had previously bumped into somebody named Galiad, who knows how to track down the snake. Furthermore, this person not only happens to be an elf skilled at warfare, but also Jung-woo's master back in the day. Long story short, Yoon soon reaches Galiad's doorstep and requests to receive the Undyne's glass from him. Simply put, it's an object containing immense spiritual aura and is therefore suitable for being used as bait to draw out the snake. Regrettably, Galiad is the only person who knows how to make this stuff. Therefore, in order to receive the object as his reward, Yoon must first prove his capability by passing the elf's test. The rules are quite simple. All Yoon has to do is play tag with the elf and catch him at least 5 out of 10 times. What's interesting though is how no more than 5 people have managed to pass the test in the last couple of decades. After all, saying that the elf is fast would be an understatement. Anyways, the test soon begins, with Galiad slipping away from sight with the speed of wind. It's no use though, since no matter how fast he is, the poor elf is unable to escape from Yoon's dragon eyes as well as his heightened senses. In such a way, the test ends pretty soon, with Yoon being rewarded with not only Undyne's glass, but also Gilead's signature skill, Blinking Steps. Turns out, it's thanks to this unique skill that the elf can dart from place to place in the blink of an eye, and is also very nimble. Anyways, Yoon too masters the skill shortly afterwards and becomes quick as the wind himself as well. Finally, he once again strolls back to Galiad, who questions Yoon why he even needs the Undyne's glass in the first place. Deciding how there's no harm in telling the elf, the dude simply reveals how he plans on hunting down the Akasha's snake. Hearing that, Galiad became quiet for a moment, and later reveals how Yoon's been beaten to this goal by others. Yep, as it happens, the tutorial stage's top 2 rankers, named Adora and Fante, have already been there first. The two, who happen to be siblings, not only bested Galiad in his test, but also ended up slaying the Akasha snake, resulting in them both obtaining its core as well, of course. That no doubt explains how the two were able to stay on top of the list of rankers, and have more than 60,000 points under their belt each. Anyways, despite having become disheartened, Yoon nonetheless nonetheless decides to pay a visit to the battle site and examine the Akasha snake's remains for himself. As expected, Goliad was telling the truth since the snake's been dead for almost a week now. However, just when he's about to walk away in despair, Yoon notices a small incision cut in the beast's skull. Not only that, but there's a ton of fresh footprints on the ground as well. From the looks of it, somebody else came along to the snake as well long after the siblings had left for good. What's strange is how the newcomers dug into the snake's skull to fetch its not-so-valuable brain from inside, and left soon after doing so. Yoon, of course, becomes curious here and decides to follow the footsteps. What the dude hadn't dreamed of, even in his wildest imagination, is how he would end up reaching the Akasha snake's lair deep underground. Apparently, a bunch of orcs that worship the snake as their god are at present trying to resurrect it using forbidden dark magic. This of course works in Yoon's favor, since he too now has the opportunity to slay the beast and obtain its core. However, since the snake has just been resurrected, it's nowhere near its original size and also quite weak. Yoon therefore starts to cook up a plan to fetch some living sacrifices in order to help the snake grow much faster than usual. The dude soon starts drooling after daydreaming about consuming the biggest ever Akasha snake's core for lunch later on. To make sure his dreams come true, the dude simply ventures deep into various monster territories and manipulates them all into starting a war against the orcs. In such a way, pretty soon a legion of not just goblins and lizardmen, but also kobolds, ogres, and trolls, etc. start heading towards the orcs' nest. What's funny is how the monster army ends up running into Orang Group's elite soldiers on their way to the orcs. Despite being strong and experienced, the poor fellas stand no chance against an entire army of bloodthirsty monsters and are therefore wiped out of existence pretty soon. Meanwhile, the orc king Farak, who's just as strong as the lizard king Hargon from before, now starts preparing to battle the incoming enemies. After all, so many living sacrifices have come looking for trouble while the orc's god is in the middle of being resurrected. That said, neither Farak himself nor the rest of his men can turn down such a tempting offer, of course. A war erupts pretty soon as a result, with the orcs going toe-to-toe against the rest of the monsters living in Block E. The smell of blood soon captures the snake's attention, who then also pops out of its hidden nest and starts rampaging through the battlefield. What's funny is how the god they worshipped so hysterically isn't even able to spell the difference between friend and foe, and thus starts consuming both the orcs as well as the rest of the monsters alike. Well, at least it's not biased, I guess. Anyways, Yoon-woo himself ventures deep inside the snake's nest while the rest are distracted. Thing is, his intuition tells him how there must be a reason why a mighty beast such as the Akasha snake is holed up inside the tutorial stage. His guess is proven correct soon after the dude ends up bumping into the mythical humanoid root. As the name suggests, it's a divine root resembling the appearance of a human kid. The snake had surely been lying in wait there for centuries, hoping for the root to mature before digesting it. Unfortunately, its long-awaited prize ends up in Yoon's belly soon. This results in not just an increase in the dude's magic power, but his physique also ends up updating from novice dragon status to that of a half-dragon body. Later on, the dude ends up running into a random pendant just when he's about to head outside. Interestingly, there's an image of Goliad together with his family engraved inside the pendant. Guess what? The reason why the elf's been hunting the Akasha snake for so long and has even been imparting his skills on the novice hunters to help him slay the beast as well was all for the sake of this pendant. Yep, since it's a precious memorial, Goliad was hoping for one of the hunters he trained to help him fetch the necklace containing his family's memories back to him. Anyways, once outside, Yoon learns how there's only about a tenth of the monsters left thanks to the infighting as well as many of them having been devoured by the snake. Furthermore, both Farak and Cranham, who are the respective kings of orcs and goblins, are at their absolute limit as well. The situation couldn't have worked out any further in Yoon's favor here. As soon as he appears, the dude jumps on top of the snake's head and utilizes his vampiric dagger to suck away all its vitality. With the snake ending up dead, its massive football-sized core ends up falling into Yoon's hands as well, and is devoured by him in a single gulp. Up next, the dude takes care of the two monster kings, both of whom are at the end of their rope after fighting for so long. Finally, the insatiable and greedy dude even forcefully absorbs the life force of the surviving hundreds of monsters. Regrettably, a ton of downtime is required to fully digest all that surplus energy he just consumed. However, as it happens, one of Orang's elite dogs named Bane somehow managed to survive the monster rush from a while back, and now plans to sneak attack Yoon while he's at his most vulnerable moment. The dude is the number 6th ranker on the tutorial list and is therefore not to be taken lightly. Thankfully enough, Goliad notices the commotion just then and walks over. The elf soon wipes Bane out of existence, noticing how he may be a threat to his friend Yoon. Soon afterwards, the exhausted Yoon hands him over the pendant he discovered not long before passing out himself. The dude wakes up in a completely refreshed manner nearly a dozen hours down the road. Goliad just then appears and expresses his gratitude to Yoon for helping him to locate his precious pendant. From the looks of it, the good-natured elf also did a thing or two to help stabilize Yoon's wild magic power. Otherwise, even exploding wouldn't have been out of the question when taking into account the heckload of essence our greedy protagonist had consumed in a single day. Yoon soon starts rummaging through the gains from his previous legendary exploits. Turns out, not only has his magic power skyrocketed beyond any other attribute, but also his body status has changed from that of a half-dragon to an incomplete dragon. Just a little more and soon his body will morph into that of an actual dragon, allowing him to harness the various strengths and special abilities of this divine race. Furthermore, the dude also managed to dig out a pitch-black bracelet from inside the snake's stomach. Said bracelet happens to be a unique artifact much like the vampiric dagger and possesses the rare dark attribute. Simply put, all thanks to the bracelet, Yoon can now not only see dead souls, but also enslave these poor souls to do his bidding. Moreover, he can even imbue his weapons with dark magic, thereby allowing him to inflict various curses upon his enemies. Last but not least, don't forget how the tower regards its participants in accordance with their achievements. That said, since Yoon deliberately incited various monsters to initiate a war, resulting in all of them getting annihilated, the lucky fellow also receives a 5-colored gem as the fruit of all his efforts. Said gem combines the abilities of various monster races and therefore leads to a sudden spike in Yoonwoo's heightened skill senses. Goliad reappears just then and reveals how the person who tried to ambush and harm Yoon back then belonged to the Orang group. This in turn makes Yoon realize how the scavengers he faced together with Khan and Doyle a couple of days ago must also be the Orang group's lackeys, since both groups were sporting the same sort of decorated weapons on themselves. Here, the dude finally realizes why Khan ended their collaboration with him in such a bitter manner. Turns out, the two had realized the Orang group's filthy nature and wished to confront it head-on. However, they at the same time didn't wish to drag Yoon into their mess for nothing and hence broke up with him. Having realized the matter's truth, our mask-loving protagonist of course can't stay idle, can he? That said, the dude rushes straight towards the Orang group's headquarters located in Block F. Meanwhile, Orang's leader, Build, pays a visit to both Khan and Doyle down in the dungeon. The two surely look miserable since they ended up losing the head-on clash against Orang and have been confined and continuously tortured down there in the basement ever since then. Build shows up just then and declares his intention of refining them both into some sort of mysterious stone soon enough. Yep, you heard me correct. In fact, the Orang group is in reality controlled by the Azure Sword Clan, one of the top 8 ranked guilds in the tower. Makes one wonder why members of such a powerful guild are idling around by wasting their time in the tutorial stage. Thing is, one of the leaders of the Azure Sword Clan, named Leonte, is the one who assigned his subordinate Build with the task of operating human farms here in the tutorial stage. Turns out, all those human slaves aren't meant to be sold, etc., just to let the mighty Azure Sword Clan earn a couple of points. Rather, all those living humans are meant to be used as materials for doing alchemy and ultimately helping prepare that mysterious stone. Anyways, the conversation is interrupted midway once the organization's base starts to shake. You guessed correctly, the masked devil is here. Soon as he comes, Yoon starts rampaging through the enemy base, chopping all those who resist him like leaves and vegetables. The commotion of course catches Build's attention as well, who then comes rushing over ASAP. One look at the enemy leader's face and Yoon recognizes who he truly is. Here we see a flashback of how his younger brother Jung-woo was stabbed together by 5 different swords back when he got betrayed by his trusted allies. 3 among them were lofty, high-ranking people who had already managed to surpass the 50th level of the tower. The 4th was Jung's beloved woman, while the 5th was his closest friend, Leonte. Yep, the Leonte who's currently hailed as one of the leaders of the Azure Sword Clan used to be Yoon's younger brother's best friend back in the day. Regrettably, the nasty fellow ended up betraying his brother and later joined the Sword Guild. Meanwhile, at the time of Jung-woo's death, Build had merely stood there, gloating at the demise of Jung and Ardea, his brainchild organization. Back in present, Yoon's temper flares up as he soon recalls Build's true identity as a lackey of the despicable Leonte. Hence, a battle ensues between them both quickly enough. What's funny is how, despite cleverly being a veteran player, Build ends up proving himself as no match against the devilish Yoon-woo. The dude's skills must have gotten rusty thanks to him indulging in human trafficking and ignoring his training these past couple of years. Anyways, the villainous dude soon realizes his inadequacy and thus makes a run for the hills. Meanwhile, Yoon restrains himself from chasing after Build right away and instead heads straight to the basement. Both Khan and Doyle are moved to tears at the sight of Yoon, as expected, of course. Unfortunately, the two happen to be in pretty bad shape and therefore can't continue facing the tutorial's challenges any further. Khan here reveals how one has the option to withdraw from the tutorial anytime they please, and then attempt to pass it in the next time, and then attempt to pass through it the next time one gets held. That said, both soon hand over all their collected treasures, including Hargan's crown, to Yoon as a gift. After all, none of that stuff will be of any use to both of them since the two plan on dropping out anyway. Later on, with the farewells over, Yoon rushes back to track down Build, who had previously rushed deep inside the group's base. Once there, the dude consumes the incomplete stone out of desperation, hoping that it will grant him a much-needed power boost. Sadly enough, nothing happens, and Yoon soon catches up with the runaway fella. It's hilarious how the previously arrogant leader of the Yarong group is almost on the verge of pissing his pants after receiving the death stare by Yoon. Our protagonist finally unveils his mask here. As expected, Build mistakes him as a dead Jung-woo since both brothers used to be quite similar in appearances. Anyways, Yoon now starts to torture the hell out of his poor opponent by utilizing the dead souls he enslaved via the black bracelet previously. The enemy is finally put to sleep forever after being forced to cough out as much intelligence as possible regarding the tower's current affairs. Before leaving though, Yoon regains the stone from inside the enemy's dead corpse. What's worrisome is how the stone automatically slides within Yoon's chest. Thankfully, the dude isn't the least bit harmed in the process and therefore decides to let the stone be until he has further information regarding its origin as well as usages. From there, Yoon heads straight towards the secret residence of the Thorn Mole, which was pointed out to him by Khan and Doyle before both of them left. The gigantic mole happens to be guarding Vigrid, a holy sword which both Khan and Doyle previously intended to use in their ultimate showdown against Fonte and Adora, the tutorial stage's current top rankers. Alas, both of them had to drop out thanks to being heavily injured. Anyways, Yoon defeats the hideous mole without breaking too much of a sweat, and therefore successfully obtains the holy sword. Later, upon regaining his breath, the dude heads straight towards the tutorial stage's last hurdle, Block G. Upon reaching there, he learns how it's basically supposed to be a battle royale between all surviving elites of the tutorial to date. What's funny though, is how all those so-called elites are currently being helplessly bullied by a single person. Yup, the ferocious madman who's been busy throwing around all the other contenders is none other than Fonte, ranked number 2 on the tutorial list. Meanwhile, Fonte's sister, Adora, who's also the current top ranker here in the tutorial, simply stands on the sidelines, watching as her uncontrollable brother runs rampant among the enemy lines. For some reason, Adora soon senses Yoon's distinguished presence nearby and flashes a smile at him. Knowing full well that his time to observe and strategize is over, the dude simply places all his cards on the table by emptying his bag full of fame beads. Basically, this bag contains all the loot as well as gifts he's he's attained from Arang, Doyle, and Khan, plus a ton of other people as well. Soon, Yoon combines his entire stash of fame beads into a single fist-sized golden bead. This successfully attracts the covetous eye of not just Adora and her brother Fonte, but also a ton of other elite players standing nearby. Can't blame them, of course. After all, just that one bead alone is worth more than 100,000 karma points and can easily bestow first rank onto anybody who's able to snatch it away. Regrettably for those folks, Yoon is certainly not a pushover. Being surrounded by plenty of hyenas, the dude simply pulls out Vigrid, his recently obtained sword with a frost as well as poisonous attribute, and uses it to unleash misery upon all his enemies. Pretty soon, the nobodies either end up directly being slashed to death or simply choked thanks to being infected by the poison. Finally, it's Fonte versus Yoon at last. Thing is, both these siblings belong to the one-horned monster tribe renowned for their martial arts prowess throughout the tower and are therefore quite formidable. Before entering the arena though, Fonte hands over his own personal fame bead to his sister for safekeeping. Soon after, the Horned Fellow attempts to turn Yoon into mincemeat by utilizing his incredible lightning fists. Next, with lots of dust being raised into the air, Yoon loses sight of his opponent and therefore suffers heavily after Fonte leverages the unclear vision to launch a swift sneak attack. Interestingly, Yoon is able to predict this outcome thanks to his foresight skill. In simple terms, the skill allows him to take a peek 3 seconds into the future, although the foresight timing is quite short, but it still bestows Yoon with a heavy advantage. After all, in battle between experts, mere seconds can spell the difference between life and death of one another. Anyways, even the monstrous Fonte obviously stands no chance against a fortune teller and therefore suffers from defeat quickly in the next couple of seconds. With Fonte defeated and 1 second of future predictions still remaining in his arsenal, Yoon goes straight for the kill by launching a surprise attack against Adora. However, things get spooky once the mysterious female reflects his blow, and in doing so defies the future. After a moment of disbelief, Yoon finally realizes how the girl's gift is insight. This means that she can judge the truth of anything or even sort through lies and deception to uncover the truth simply by viewing stuff with her eyes. Long story short, Adora had long since seen through Yoon's foresight skill by means of her exceptional eyes, and therefore escapes his deadly blow without receiving a single scratch. Such an opponent that can't be deceived is truly a force to be reckoned with. What's funny is how Yoon's main agenda was never truly to injure Adora in the first place. Rather, he had been aiming for the fame beads hanging by her waist. As a result, the dude's able to steal the fame beads of both these top-ranking siblings without having to put in much effort at all. With his goal fulfilled, the dude realizes his insane speed to slip away ASAP. What's funny is how, instead of resenting him for snatching away her hard-earned fame beads, the innocent-looking Adora instead starts considering him as cool and ultimately ends up falling for the lucky fella. Anyhow, the tutorial round is finally concluded as well soon enough. Soon every contestant's jaw drops to the ground upon hearing the announcement of results. Turns out, you set an unprecedented record by single-handedly claiming more than 5 lakh points in just the tutorial round. What baffles people is how he could have easily obtained the first place even without snatching away the fame beads from the one-horned siblings. This only leads to one conclusion: that Yoon is in fact an insatiable fellow with boundless greed in his eyes. That's basically how the fellow ends up getting stuck with the nickname the Hoarder. Furthermore, the dude is even rewarded with Zeus's key along with many other precious artifacts. Turns out, there's 11 more such keys in existence, with the rest to be obtained from within the tower. Once together, those 12 keys can help Yoon unlock and enter the Treasury of Olympus. As the name suggests, it's a treasury vault left in place by the ancient gods, and therefore is filled to the brim with undeniable treasures. Anyways, entering the Treasury of Olympus is a future bridge to cross and therefore none of Yoon's concern at the moment. Interestingly, Adora walks over just then and congratulates Yoon for his miraculous achievement. For a moment there, the fella is put off guard after acknowledging the sincerity in the eyes of his former opponent. Meanwhile, Fonte is still bothered heavily by his defeat, and therefore continues itching for round 2. Regrettably for him, our unconventional protagonist isn't one to be provoked so easily. Instead, the low-key fella simply instantly admits his defeat and walks away right after. In the meantime, rumors of a mysterious super rookie spread throughout the tower like wildfire. Unfortunately, since both Yoon's name as well as his face are a secret, none of the many clans dying to recruit him are even able to track him down in the first place. On the flip side, Yoon himself decides to wander in the outer district for a while instead of heading straight for the tower floors. The Dune soon makes his way to a blacksmith named Heneva's shop. From the looks of it, the place has been deserted as well as devoid of any customers for quite a while now. Just then, a dwarf steps inside the shop and questions Yoon's presence there. Turns out the dwarf is none other than Heneva, one of the 5 top-ranked blacksmiths in the tower space. Though what Yoon is really concerned about is Heneva's affiliation with his dead younger brother. Yep, back then, when he was alive, Jung-woo used to consider Heneva as a father figure and therefore loved hanging around with him quite often. Furthermore, Heneva is also perhaps the only person who truly had Jung's back till the bitter end. Sadly enough, poor Heneva paid a heavy price for his loyalty. As it happens, the enemy clans punished him by harassing and effectively shooing away all of his customers, thus putting an end to his career as a renowned blacksmith. Back in the present, Yoon-woo simply puts all his rewards from the tutorial stage on display and offers to exchange them in return for Heneva's help on a specific matter. Thing is, Yoon wishes for the genius blacksmith to help him prepare a rare armor referred to as the Eye of the Guise. The cranky dwarf is suspicious of Yoon's true motives at first, but nonetheless agrees to fulfill his request soon enough. Later that night, the dwarf becomes offended after catching Yoon dead asleep while he himself is busy working his ass off. The angered dwarf thus throws a hammer at Yoon and curses at the lazy fellow to get up and hammer some iron. In such a way, a couple of weeks pass by with Yoon carefully learning the art of metallurgy under Heneva's careful supervision. Doing so even helps with his dragon body succession to progress a bit. After all, psychological growth is no less vital than its physical counterpart. But pretty soon though, the peaceful vibes are interrupted after enemy clans come looking for trouble. The bullies not only raze Heneva's shop to the ground, but also steal away all his belongings. This greatly infuriates Yoon, who then rushes over to their base ASAP and eliminates most of those bothersome flies. The ones that survive aren't much better off since they're to slave around by repairing Heneva's shop, etc. That way, the previously pathetic smithery ends up looking pristine in just a couple of days. This greatly cheers up Heneva, who again starts working on Yoon's commission with renewed passion. On the following day, Fonte finally catches a whiff of Yoon's current residence at Heneva's place and then comes rushing together with his sister ASAP. What's funny is how Yoon becomes agitated once the battle freak smashes his way inside the newly built shop. As a result, poor Horn Kid is soon put in his place by the agitated Yoon. Time flies by in such a way when Heneva cursing the moments when both the annoying Yoon as well as Fonte ever walk inside his shop. Anyways, other clans hear news of Yoon's presence in the outer district as well, and therefore rush over to recruit him. As expected though, Yoon declines each of their offers, claiming how he is not in the mood to become affiliated with any sort of clan as of yet. Astonishingly, an ex-Ardia member named Bahal appears inside the cafe as well, hoping to recruit the super rookie for his Red Dragon clan. As it happens, Bahal used to be a buddy of Jung previously and was therefore also a vital member of his clan Ardia. However, the traitorous dude slipped away and joined the villainous Red Dragon clan once things started falling apart. Anyways, for the moment, Yoon obviously isn't willing to get on the wrong side of this wolf in human skin, and thus politely declines Bahal's generous offer. Once back at the shop, Heneva reveals how the Eyes of Guise has finally been completed by him. Unlike the name though, the final object isn't some sort of creepy eye, etc., but rather a black trench coat with plentiful eye patterns engraved upon it. Besides that, the gracious Heneva also ends up preparing a more suitable mask for Yoon. Both these items are able to help boost Yoon's various stats, such as attack and defense, by a significant margin to say the least. With his desired product finally having been made, Yoon decides it's time to start climbing the tower after all. The masked fellow thus bids his farewell to Heneva and attempts to leave ASAP. Interestingly though, the one-horned siblings rush over to intercept him just then and accuse Yoon for attempting to slip away without them. The cheeky Adora even declares their intent of following Yoon from henceforwards, whether he likes it or not. Seeing no harm in it, Yoon simply lets the siblings tag along, provided that they do not hamstring his own progress. The three finally enter and participate in the tower's first floor. Turns out, the first 10 floors are lumped together as the beginner zone of the tower, and it's within these 10 floors where Yoon is to obtain the remaining 11 keys required for opening the treasury of Olympus. Simply put, one has to beat the previous record by finishing all 10 floors in less than 10 days in order to obtain the key of Hades. As for the remaining 10 keys, Yoon will be able to acquire one on each floor, as long as he continues breaking previous records and setting new ones in their place. Anyways, the first floor's manager arrives just then and starts explaining the rules. It's quite simple actually, since all participants are divided into 2 teams, both consisting of 100 players, while also being provided with 5 crystals each as well. The mission is simple. Snatch away enemy crystals while defending the ones belonging to you by whatever means necessary. Although passing in this round shouldn't be much of an issue, what really concerns Yoon is whether he'll be able to secure Hera's key or not. After all, to become eligible for the key, one has to monopolize all 10 crystals himself. Regrettably, the enemy team can smash apart their own crystals anytime they wish, and hence it's a mission impossible if we're being honest here. Just then, the manager questions which of the players on Yoon's side wants to retain the 5 crystals for safekeeping. Funny thing is, Fonte forcefully usurps all 5 crystals, despite the endless complaints from his fellow comrades. Turns out, the siblings had previously come to attempt the floor as well, but failed to pass all thanks to Fonte's stupidity. That time, the idiotic fellow had snatched away all of the crystals for himself as well, just like today. However, instead of keeping his distance in order to protect the crystals back then, the dim-witted Fonte instead went on a rampage, resulting in all of his team's crystals being shattered by the enemy one by one. One ought to have learned a lesson after such a failure, but not Fonte, of course. Thankfully, Yoon walks over just then and straightforwardly commands Fonte to hand over all 5 of those crystals to him for safekeeping. Later on, he instructs Adora to safeguard the territory while he's away. Up next, everybody's jaws drop to the floor once the insane fellow leaps into the enemy's side, like a wolf entering a herd of cattle and sheep. Fast forward half an hour and everybody on the enemy team is dead thanks to Yoon going on an instant killing spree. Heck, the devilish fellow didn't even give the opponents any chance to react whatsoever, and therefore was able to beat them by the element of surprise as well as overwhelming force. This concludes the first trial, with Yoon having soloed the tasks all by himself, while also successfully obtaining all 10 of those crystals. The trial at floor 2 begins right afterwards. The task at hand here is to subdue the various monster factions in the forest such as goblins, kobolds, lizardmen, etc. As expected, such a mission turns out to be a mere piece for Yoon, who had previously even instigated as well as conquered an entire monster rush in the tutorial round. Time flies by like that, and soon Yoon even successfully slays the fire beast on floor 9. Finally, upon stepping inside the 10th floor, the dude discovers himself standing in the middle of nowhere. Turns out, it's the Void Realm, a place where only those with outstanding willpower can escape from. Here, Yoon recalls his brother's words about how the 10th floor serves as an insurmountable wall for plenty of newbies attempting to climb the tower. However, such a visual deception proves futile in front of Yoon's truth-piercing dragon eyes. That said, the dude soon spots a hidden door, and thereby successfully escapes from the Void Realm. Altogether, Yoon had taken 6 days or so to pass all 10 floors at the beginner zone. That said, the previous record of 10 days set by his brother Jong, together with his team Ardia, is now finally broken at the hands of Yoon. Moreover, the masked fellow is also successfully able to father all 12 keys of the Olympian gods after having continuously set new records throughout the journey. Yoon thus combines all 12 keys in his possession into the key of Olympus. Doing so helps manifest the gate of the treasury of Olympus right away. Once inside, the fellow was a bit amazed to see Hermes, one of the 12 major Olympian gods, standing guard inside the treasury. As it happens, Hermes has been quite intrigued by Yoon's performance lately, and had therefore been keeping a close eye on him for quite a while now. The free-spirited god was actually impressed by Yoon's talents and therefore offers to let Yoon become an apostle. In the simplest of terms, apostles are lucky individuals charged with carrying out the will of any particular god here in the mortal realm. Furthermore, their respective gods even bestow a fraction of their power upon their chosen apostles, making them extremely powerful. Long story short, becoming an apostle for one of the 12 major gods is a sure surefire way to quickly ascend the tower and become one of the most authoritative figures present within it. Despite the innumerable benefits, Yoon instantly declines the tempting offer, since becoming tied to any particular individual or organization is absolutely out of the question for him. Hermes is obviously a bit disappointed, but nonetheless doesn't appear to hold a grudge against our protagonist for any such a puny matter. Soon afterwards, Yoon makes his way to Zeus's astropae, which is in fact the most valuable treasure present within this space. Seeing as he's only allowed to keep any one treasure for himself, why not go for the best? Unfortunately, the astropae holding Zeus's incredible lightning power in store simply vanishes the moment Yoon attempts to grab it. Furthermore, a black chain appears in the astropae's place and automatically wraps itself around his arm. Since the tower rewards the individual according to their own efforts as well as philosophy of life, the astropae being substituted with the Black King's chain must have something to do with Yoon's loner tendencies. Alas, there is no use whining about stuff that's already gone. As for the shield, it basically allows one to not only capture and store an endless amount of soups, but he can also use various means to turn any of these souls into spirit familiars. Doing so would help Yoon build an army of faithful slaves that won't dare betray him. Anyways, the goblin managers appear just then and offer Athena's shield to Yoon as a reward for breaking various records in the beginner zone a while back. Afterwards, Yoon makes a beeline straight for the 11th floor. Once inside, he learns how the mission here is to basically take care of an egg until his very own pet monster sprouts out of it. What's interesting though is how nobody's ever sure what kind of monster will pop out of said egg. In the end, the monster's identity upon hatching depends on what kind of thoughts, dreams, and emotions its owner feeds it while still in the egg. Yoon, of course, isn't going to settle for some sort of a mediocre pet standing by his side, and therefore heads straight to the legendary Fire Phoenix's residence to obtain its holy fire. Said fire will surely work wonders upon being fed to his egg. Regrettably, the Phoenix appears to be in an especially bad mood today. Turns out, some nasty thief stole away one of her eggs while she herself was distracted by another matter. Thankfully, the Phoenix promises to bestow Yoon with the Fire of Life should he succeed in recovering her lost egg. Said mission proves to be a cinch since the two thieves had already turned against one another by the time Yoon arrives. The dude is therefore able to take advantage of their lack of harmony and match away the egg in a matter of seconds. Once back at the Phoenix's residence, the legendary beast lived up to her reputation by providing Yoon with a seed of her holy flame. Unfortunately, a super strong container is required to contain this ever-burning flame. As a result, Yoon's next mission is to gather tons of container-making materials as suggested by the Phoenix itself. Before leaving though, the dude utilizes the black chain on his right arm to transform a wandering soul into a spirit familiar. Said familiar will always follow its master Yoon's orders down to the letter and with zero objections. There's also, of course, zero risk of being betrayed by your own spirit slaves. That said, such familiars which can continue to grow stronger alongside Yoon will definitely serve as a major support for our loner protagonist. Furthermore, the spirit soul is able to receive and follow many complex orders from Yoon without breaking a sweat. As a result, the dude decides to take out some other boss souls he acquired from the beginner zone previously. The strongest among those souls are soon transformed into spirit familiars as well. As for the top three, Yoon names them as Bu, Ka, and Nol, respectively. Up next, he decides to train using the Athena's shield he acquired previously from inside the treasury of Olympus. Said shield is blessed by the goddess Athena's divine power and therefore has many benefits attached besides the obvious defense feature. As a result, the dude spends the next entire week training himself to become more proficient in the shield's usage, while also guiding his spirit familiars on how to keep getting stronger. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Leonte from the Azure Sword clan just returns back from the tutorial in a hugely disappointed manner. After all, his years of effort became wasted after his minion Build was slain by Yoon back in the tutorial stage. Leonte couldn't care about his subordinate Build's life, of course. After all, the nasty fellow previously even backstabbed his best friend Jong to death before finally becoming one of the leaders of the Azure Sword clan. That said, what Leonte truly regrets is the loss of his precious Philosopher's Stone, which also became stolen by Yoon Woo once he annihilated the Orang group back in the tutorial phase. What's funny though is how Bahal from the Red Dragon clan also somehow learns about the Philosopher's Stone. That said, the Flame Dude lies in ambush at the place where Leonte shall emerge on his way back from the tutorial. As expected, Bahal and his fellow henchmen beat the shit out of Leonte and even tear apart one of his arms. Interestingly, Leonte somehow manages to escape from Bahal's fearsome clutches at last and returns to his clan to report the transgression. The incident, of course, serves as the catalyst for the upcoming war between the Azure Sword clan as well as the Red Dragon clan, which are among the 8 largest clans in the tower. On the flip side, Yoon finally bids farewell to the Phoenix and heads straight into the depths of the 11th floor. Thus begins Yoon's journey of plundering all the various dungeons and forests of their various treasures and resources. Things are much easier now, since most enemies can easily be handled by the puppet's souls without Yoon having to lift a finger himself. What's funny though is how many of the other players on floor 11 become disgruntled since Yu keeps hogging all the rare delicacies and treasures for himself, forcing the rest of his fellow players to return back home empty-handed. Such an outcome is to be expected, of course. After all, Yoon isn't nicknamed the Hoarder for nothing. Anyways, the dude soon heads straight for a pub in some nearby city to scout for news. Once there, the pub attendant reveals news about the upcoming war between the 2 major factions, and how it's supposed to take place here on the 11th floor due to the abundance of resources available in this place. Soon upon leaving though, the wretched pub attendant informs a ton of other smaller clans regarding Yoon's identity as the greedy hoarder, who's been laying waste to all the resources on the 11th floor recently. As a result, a couple of clans corner Yoon in a deserted clearing that night, hoping to snatch away all his belongings. Poor fellas are soon faced with the bitter reality once Yoon's fearsome spirit familiars make an abrupt appearance and start slaughtering them like cattle and sheep. Furthermore, the fog being emitted by the soul puppets make it next to impossible for the enemies to keep in touch while also forcing them to panic non-stop. Upon clearing the battlefield, Yoon also sends back a single soul puppet to deal with the pub owner, who's been spreading malicious rumors about him lately. Meanwhile, the dude himself returns the Phoenix together with the ingredients required for making a container. The Phoenix too upholds her end of the bargain by providing Yoon with a superior quality flame of life. Regrettably, the egg just keeps growing without any signs of the beast popping out anytime soon. Heck, even after being fed with a dozen or more such flames, there's no sign of the egg hatching anytime soon. Yoon thus gives up hatching himself a mighty beast and instead decides to be patient for a while. On the contrary, both Fonte and Adora were summoned back to their tribe after the war was announced. Turns out, a vital member of the One-Horned tribe now serves as one of the 5 gods of the Azure Sword clan. That said, despite being neutral before, the One-Horned tribe has no other choice but to participate in the war this time around. Adora soon sends an informant from the tribe to help update Yoon regarding their current situation. Anyways, since his egg-hatching quest for the 11th floor has been put on hold for a while, Yoon decides how paying a visit to the One-Horned tribe might prove beneficial, especially since there's nothing else to do after all. Fast forward a couple of hours, and Yoon's already sitting in the presence of Martial King Nayu, who's not just the ruler of the One-Horned tribe, but also Fonte and Adora's father. Once the greetings have been dealt with, Yoon inquires about whether the tribe has a method to help him hatch the egg. Adora then reveals how her tribe possesses the rare lunar herb which may prove quite beneficial when trying to hatch this egg. However, as we all know, there's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Seeing how precious the herb is, Nayu promises to hand it over only if Yoon Woo first assists the tribe in the upcoming war. Our masked protagonist, of course, isn't bothered by such a condition. After all, either way, he would sooner or later have to confront the ruling clans of the tower so long as he wishes to avenge his brother. Hence, assisting the One-Horned tribe in the upcoming war in return for the lunar grass is like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Long story short, Yoon happily agrees to the deal and is soon therefore declared as a member of the One-Horned tribe from there forward. However, the moon is soon spoiled by Jung. who's yet another son of the martial king Nayu, as well as a stepbrother to both Fonte and Adora. From the looks of it, the dude is a strong contender for the throne, just like Fonte, and therefore doesn't wish to see somebody close to his step-siblings become favored by the tribe. June argues how an outsider like Yoon can't be trusted without having his strength verified first. Left with no other choice, Yoon agrees to a duel against Jung in the tribe's arena. What's funny is how the poor horned fellow is forced to eat dirt mere seconds after the battle starts. Such an outstanding performance, when coupled together with Yoon's cool personality, earns him major support from the tribesmen, especially since they've all been considering him as their young Miss Adora's future husband for quite a while now. Anyways, Yoon shamelessly requests to learn the One-Horned tribe's secret martial arts later that night. However, cute-faced Adora, of course, isn't willing to turn down a request from her crush, despite how outrageous it might be. The girl thus promises to give it a try by consulting her father on the subject. Surprisingly, Nayu agrees to let Yoon study the tribe's secret cultivation techniques, so long as he's able to prove himself worthy enough in a test first. Simply put, Yoon will be granted access to both the Iron as well as the Bronze tier skill archives of the One-Horned tribe for the upcoming 4 days. As for his test, it's simply a rummage through all those skills archives, learn as much as he can, and finally end up creating his own cultivation manual, no matter how basic it is. Such a thing is of course easier said than done. After all, Yoon has a measly 4 days to innovate a field of which he doesn't even know the ABCs yet. However, the rewards for fulfilling Yanu's test are just as awesome. After all, the martial king Nayu himself promises to teach Yoon and even bestows his self-created 8 extremes fist upon the masked fellow should he succeed the test. At least there's no harm in trying so far for the next 4 days. Yoon continuously drowns in the sea of cultivation manuals, scriptures, and techniques, etc. As expected, it proves difficult to get used to the cultivation world's technical jargon at first. However, Yoon starts getting the hang of terms such as acupuncture, mana circuits, etc., and is even able to finally formulate a new martial arts theory. As expected, Martial King Nayu is completely won over by his newly acquired student's impressive performance in the ridiculously tough test he came up with. Anyhow, the teacher then puts on a fancy display of his own mighty strength at the request of his student Yoon. One slash is all it takes to rip apart the barrier of time and space into tiny fragments up in the sky. Yoon, of course, is surely bedazzled by the sight, and becomes impatient about when exactly he'll be able to wield such strength as well. Later that night, Nayu finally assembles all his tribesmen for a tiny pep talk in preparation for the war that may break out any time now. Later on in privacy, he even summons his student Yoon and starts teaching him his self-created technique, 8 extreme fists as promised earlier. Thanks to his insane memory as well as learning capacity, Yoon, the freak, is able to memorize the entire technique after a single demonstration. From there, the dude continues practicing all his martial arts regularly until he becomes fairly proficient in them. Soon, the One-Horned tribe takes the lead in initiating the war by attacking one of the Red Dragon clan's subordinate cities. It's basically a one-sided massacre, considering how it was a surprise attack launched in the dead of night, plus the fact that the One-Horned tribe's king Nayu is literally invincible on the battlefield. Anyways, Nayu single-handedly defeats as well as kidnaps the ruling committee of that city and brings them over to where Yoon and the rest are standing. Here's the deal. All 5 captives have to participate, so can any of them regain their freedom. As far as Yoon, the guy remains on high alert. After all, these folk may act like household chickens in the presence of his master, the Martial King, but they surely aren't people a newbie such as him can ignore. Anyways, one-on-one battles begin just then. Pretty soon, Yoon stands exhausted next to the corpse of 4 of his enemies. However, the 5th remaining opponent, named Shannon, isn't to be underestimated. After all, he's a semi-ranker who had previously been on the verge of passing the 50th floor and stepping into the ranks of those mighty high rankers. As expected, Yoon has a hard time dealing with Shannon and is soon forced into a corner. The credit, of course, goes to Shannon's greater battle as well as martial arts experience, especially his utilization of focal points technique, which basically allows him to switch his attacks between countless possibilities on the very last moment. thus making it extremely difficult for newbie martial artists such as Yoon to predict or even defend against his attacks. Thankfully, Yoon Woo too has an ace in the hole, which is his foresight skill, of course. Thanks to such a skill that allows him to peek a few seconds into the future, Yoon is finally able to embed his sword inside the difficult opponent's chest and force him dead. Before dying though, Shannon pleads for Yoon to let his many subordinates off the hook since they aren't much of a threat anyway. Yoon of course is highly impressed by Shannon's ethics and therefore collects his soul for the purpose of turning him into a slave minion later on. Meanwhile, Saber God, who's one of the top 5 gods of the Azure Sword clan, now goes on a rampage in the 11th floor by exterminating all 4 legendary beasts, the Phoenix included of course, one by one to avoid them becoming distractions during the ongoing war. On the flip side, Yoon is able to sense the Phoenix's distress from over here, and therefore rushes to her rescue right away. Regrettably, the noble Phoenix is dead by the time he finally arrives. Surprisingly though, its youngest child named Chirpy managed to survive somehow. Coincidentally, it's the same one that Yoon previously saved from the hands of thieves not that long ago. Anyways, the dead Phoenix's soul resurfaces just then, and so it willingly bestows her original holy flame obsessor. Up next, the dude visits the Void Dragon as well as the Water Turtle's territory one by one. Sadly enough, both of them have been exterminated as well by now. Same as before though, both these beasts let Yoon inherit their precious powers for the sake of vengeance, as well as find a worthy heir respectively. What's funny though is how the 4th remaining legendary beast, named the Saber-toothed Tiger, is still alive by the time Yoon rushes over. However, the stubborn beast's pride refuses to let it turn its back towards the enemy and run away. Instead, the stupid beast stays in anticipation of the Saber God's arrival and, as expected, is stabbed to death soon afterwards. Yoon soon reappears once the Saber God takes his leave. Seeing how rude the idiotic tiger is, he simply decides to use his vampiric dagger to plunder away all of its remaining powers and energy. Doing so not only grants Yoon the title of the 4 legendary beasts' successor, but also boosts his many player stats significantly. Furthermore, Chirpy also evolves into a stronger version after consuming the saber-toothed tiger's leftover spirit bead. Finally, since taking care of Chirpy can also be considered equal to raising his own pet, Yoon therefore is able to pass the 11th floor without waiting for his own lousy egg to hatch and everything. Anyways, the dude heads back straight to his master after this incident and asks for permission to leave the tribe. After all, the One-Horned tribe is allied with the Azure Sword clan. As for Yoon himself, he has an immediate grudge against the Azure Sword clan's Saber God for exterminating Chirpy's mother. The martial king Nayu of course agrees to such a request. After all, he and his tribe are merely participating in the war as mercenaries and therefore aren't really that fond of the Sword Guild themselves. Both Fonte and Adora of course tag along once Yoon finally exits the tribe for good. What's interesting though is how the cunning dude heads straight for the Red Dragon clan and offers to join them. Hearing the news of the Hoarder's arrival, Bahal of course comes rushing ASAP and gives Yoon Woo and the other 2 a warm welcome. Surprisingly, the Red Dragon clan isn't too suspicious towards the martial king Nayu's 2 children. Adora and her brother Fontes wish to join their clan as well. After all, the One-Horned tribe has a policy of never interfering much with its individual members' life choices at all. Anyways, once the welcome ceremony is over, Bahal is seen kneeling in front of the Summer Queen, who's the current ruler of the Red Dragon clan. In fact, clan happens to have been named after her, since her true body is actually that of a ferocious red dragon. It's a pity though that during the clash against Ardia back in the past, Yoon's younger brother Jong did a number on her by destroying her dragon heart with a punch of his. Because of that, the arrogant-looking Summer Queen from today is nowhere near as powerful as her heyday. That said, the whole point of initiating a war against the Azure Sword clan is for her to steal the Philosopher's Stone that Leonte had prepared back in the tutorial stage. Said stone can help her restore her dragon heart as well as her former glory. Guess it would be funny if both the Summer Queen came to know that the stone she and her men have been desperately searching for is in fact hidden right under their nose these days. After all, Yoon did snatch away said stone from Build back in the tutorial stage. Anyways, Bahal later pays a visit to Yoon to discuss battle tactics. However, not in his dreams had the redhead thought of ever obtaining a valuable piece of information from Yoon during their little conversation. Turns out, Yoon had previously read in his brother's diary about how the Azure Sword Clan's lonesome saber god has a hidden child in fact. Said child remains quite ill 24/7 and has therefore never been exposed to the outer world. Needless to say, Saber God cares deeply for his aforementioned child, and therefore kidnapping this child might as well turn the tables in the Red Dragon Clan's favor once and for all. Yoon thus heads straight for the 16th floor where said child is located. As usual, the greedy fella sucks dry all the resources on his way up to the 16th floor. Finally, the Saber God goes crazy once the news of his son's capture goes live. In his anguish, the single-minded dude even turns against his own allies in the Azure Sword Clan and starts leading a rebellion. Meanwhile, Yoon grants his spiritual puppet named Boo with his recent loot from the tower floors. Doing so allows Boo to evolve into a proper lick, thus making it a ton times stronger as well as far more intelligent than before. Heck, the scary like dude can now even personally lead all other slave souls in the battle as well, saving Yoon from having the trouble of commanding souls himself. On the flip side, Saber God's rebellion dies out quickly at the hands of the clan's leader, the mysterious and almighty Sword God. Before dying though, Saber God utilizes the power of the legendary beast cores he consumed previously on the 11th floor to open up a portal and summon the Red Dragon Clan's entire army. Even for someone as composed as the Sword God, it's quite a shock after witnessing the Summer Queen appear into his territory out of the blue, and even that in her original dragon form. Not only that, but the precious beads secured from exterminating the 4 legendary beasts have also been wasted thanks to the idiotic Saber God. What's funny is how Yoon, who appears on stage together with the rest of the Dragon Clan members, now ends up absorbing whatever's left of the legendary beast's energy from the atmosphere. Unlike others, the dude has the advantage of being hailed as the 4 legendary beasts' successor, and is therefore able to suck dry most of the surrounding energy all by himself. Doing so finally helps him complete his draconic body succession at last, resulting in a significant leap in Yoon's player stats as well as his individual body composition. On the contrary, the infuriated Sword God now starts clashing against the hateful Summer Queen in her dragon form together with the Spear God and the Bow God. In the meantime, Yoon himself slips away to hunt down both Leonte as well as Bahal at last. After all, these two wretched folks used to be his brother's trusted allies and best friends once, but later ended up betraying him, especially Leonte, who held one of the 5 swords that pierced Jong's heart back in the day. Meanwhile, both Leonte and Bahal are of course unaware of the fact that a pair of sinister eyes are staring at them from within the darkness. Instead, the idiots continue sparring against one another as if their lives depend on it, which they actually do, I guess. Anyways, Leonte soon pulls out his 2 trump cards. Turns out, the fellow had previously stolen the power of Yoon's dead brother's mythical dragon beast. Such intense spiritual aura will of course help Leonte turn the tide of the current battle in his favor. Not only that, but the dude is also currently in possession of Gungrir, which is Den's divine spear, and has temporarily been handed over to him by the Sword God. With these two combined, Leonte's power skyrockets, and so the despicable dude is able to land a heavy blow on Bahal. The redhead of course is furious upon discovering that he lost one of his arms just now thanks to Leonte relying on borrowed power. Interestingly, Yoon intervenes just then and is able to slay the exhausted Leonte with a single sneak attack. Up next, before the flabbergasted Bahal has any time to process the situation at hand, the overbearing Yoon utilizes his newly acquired dragon domain to trap both Bahal as well as the rest of his men inside that specific area. Boo, the like, as well as the other dead souls materialize just then and go on a killing spree. Poor Bahal's jaw almost drops to the ground upon learning how Yoon not only possesses the power of the dragons, but also the rare death attribute. Anyways, the redhead soon realizes how it's useless attempting to slip away at this point. Hence, the dude finally decides to live up to his name as the Flame Fist Bahal and summons his last bit of power to eradicate Yoon in one go. Unfortunately, things don't go as planned, and instead, poor Bahal ends up getting slashed in two on the other hand. Yoon is finally satisfied after witnessing his vengeance scheme bearing fruit, plus having also obtained the 4 legendary beast cores as well as the mythical dragon's power. As a result, the dude quietly slips away from the battle zone together with Fonte and Adora. On the flip side, Bogod betrays the Azure Sword Clan at the last moment by heavily injuring the Sword God. Meanwhile, the Spear God Flank, who's also Marshal King Nayu's younger brother, now dies while trying to protect his leader, the Sword God. Thanks to this, as well as the efforts of countless other suicidal maniacs from the Sword Clan, the Sword God is finally able to escape the battlefield as well, in a rather miserable manner. Back at the One-Horn Tribe, the ruthless Marshal King cuts all ties with the Azure Sword Clan, since he isn't very fond of allying his tribe with a bunch of weaklings. As for Yoon, the dude keeps contemplating his next few moves, such as hatching his egg, further climbing the tower, improving his martial arts, and becoming more proficient in the usage of his draconic powers, etc. This wraps up the current chapter's end, and we're left pondering several mysteries. First of all, what kind of mighty beast will hatch? Furthermore, will all 4 of Chu King's lovers fare well together when forced to share a man or not? After all, it's quite preposterous for a man to marry more than a single woman in this weird and messed up world. Last but not least, what will become of Chu King's arranged marriage agreement with Gong Yu? Simply put, will poor Chu King be held responsible by his grandmother Chu Anlan for daring to tear apart the wedding agreement? Anyways, we'll surely pull the curtains and reveal the answers to all questions from above within the next recap of this webtoon. There is one catch though. Simply put, you can either be a subscriber or say goodbye to all future recaps from this manhwa.